Hi, I'm Matt Caraccio of the Saturday to Sunday Football Podcast, and today I'm going to share with you a consideration for reframing player evaluation in American football. This is called the player ProblemSolver paradigm. In order to understand how I got to this position and the evolution of this paradigm, I wanted to share with you where my paradigm previously was coming from. So, as an evaluator of film, I don't have access to player profiles, interviews, coach interviews, things that would really enrich an evaluation. I simply don't have access to. I simply have access to telecasts or Game Pass or other types of publicly available film resources. So for me, my resources are film, and the type of film that I'm privy to is very limited in scope at times. So with that in mind, I asked myself, what are the guiding principles that I was using? And for the most part, I was using context-driven, scheme, and trait-based analysis to answer many of the questions that I was looking to ask about when evaluating a prospect. The scale that I was using was on average positional player performance, and the positional grading scale ranged from poor to elite. And here are an example of some of the traits that I was looking for at the wide receiver position. I was looking for athleticism, releases, play strength, yards after the catch, body control, so on and so forth. And the type of evaluation that I was producing was a written evaluation consisting of qualitative data, anthropomorphic data, injury history, combine data, players' strengths and weaknesses, as I saw on film, and scheme fit. And the thing I began to ask myself was, my interpretation of the current evaluative paradigm was pretty much like this. I basically saw myself looking at the traits that defined a position, and I was trying to understand the traits that average to high-level performers shared in common. I was looking to maximize the area that those performers share in common, looking for those traits that high performers and average performers share in common, and I was looking to minimize the identification of these traits. So in essence, the goal was, if I can find players that share traits in common with high performers and average performers, well, then those players are going to have a greater chance of success. The problem is that as I began to do this more and more seriously, and as a fan of the sport, I continue to see players that have traits that exist beyond this kind of overlap begin to show how good they were. Not all players are really captured or reconciled within this paradigm. A trait became something that I began to really think about a little bit more deeply, and I wondered to myself, a trait is typically defined as an inherited characteristic within biological organisms. So I wondered, is my understanding of a trait a bit misled? I mean, if a trait is really something that's inherited by a biological organism, meaning it's like genetic, am I looking at things that are genetic, or am I looking at something else entirely? So my motivation for reframing was really that I saw things that were occurring. Like, for example, I saw myself not really having an accurate understanding of things like body control, vision, power, agility, change of direction, speed. These were terms that I was using readily, but I felt like my depth of understanding left too much ambiguity in terms of the usage that I was using. I was giving players a good vision grade without really understanding necessarily the complexity of the visual system. I was talking about things like lateral agility, when in reality, agility being lateral or not lateral is of no consequence. I really felt that there was terminology and language that I was subscribing to without really knowing the deeper understandings. I didn't know if there was a better answer out there. And I felt like I was normalizing all of the evaluations to the average player, but all of these unique performers seemed to kind of escape my glance. Philip Lindsay, Doug Baldwin, Russell Wilson, to name a few, Wes Welker, even Doug Flutie. These would all be players that don't necessarily fit within that overlap of average to high level performers. They don't have all those traits, but yet their ability to play the game is certainly without question. The biggest thing that I kept coming back to was this understanding of contextualize. We keep saying contextualize. What does contextualize mean? And I realized that I didn't really have a good answer for that. I mean, when I looked it up in the actual dictionary, it said that it's the interrelated conditions in which something exists or occurs. And I realized that my understanding was pretty much reduced down to what was the down and distance of the play that you observed, what type of offensive or defensive scheme did you actually observe the player playing in, who was the opponent that they played against, and was there any weather conditions to be aware of. And while all of these checkboxes were being filled in, I didn't understand how each of them could kind of interrelate in order to shape the performance on the field. And no understanding how down, distance, and field position could interrelate with defensive or offensive scheme in relation to the opponent or the weather on the field. I didn't have a framework for kind of understanding how and why that may shape the performance on the field. So they became more checkboxes than really critical components of the evaluation. So I asked myself, I need a framework that resolves each of the following. First, I've got to figure out a framework that includes uniquely traded players. I need a framework that incorporates how traits and context relate. And finally, I need a framework for performance or skill on the field. Because if everything is going to be interrelated or interrelating, then I need to understand a better scale for understanding performance on the field. So through the actual mentorship of many people in the movement science and skill acquisition community, I began to kind of investigate this idea of complex systems. And this was something that a friend and mentor of mine, Sean Mishka of Football Beyond the Stats, as well as Movement Mastery, those are his key things that he works on. Outstanding resource, incredibly knowledgeable. He was just really instrumental in pushing me down a road that I'll share with you in a moment. But it led back to this idea of looking at the game in terms of complex systems. And by complex systems, I'm talking about a system being something that is a set of elements standing in interrelation. When we look at the game and we look at the sport of football, we realize that there are many characteristics of complex systems. And these are some of them that were shared by Davids and colleagues in 2008. Complex systems have to share several characteristics. First of all, there must be many independent and variable degrees of freedom. Also, there must be many subsystems in order for something to be a complex system. There also has to be nonlinearity of behavior, and also the ability for subsystems to affect one another. So I began to ask myself, the game that I was watching seemed to have many different parts to it. Is it, in fact, a complex system? So if you consider for a moment degrees of freedom, well, certainly there's many degrees of freedom within the game of football. When you consider the player has many degrees of freedom, as well as the different types of coordinative structures in terms of configurations of the team, the formations we use on the field. There's definitely many different ways to form players on the field. Also, there's many subsystems when you consider the game. There's various subsystems, the human body, the weather. These are all very different subsystems. There's also non-linearity of behavior. There's explosive plays, being in the zone. You'll notice, protracted periods of time where one team seems to dominate another team. Certainly, these are things that are non-linear in behavior. We can't predict it. Sometimes just the flow of the game just presents these opportunities. And also, tactics and strategies and injuries are ways in which subsystems can affect one another. But also within the game is the player. And the player himself is also a complex system. The musculoskeletal system of each player. There's many degrees of freedom, how we can move our body. There's also many subsystems within a player. The nervous, circulatory, and respiratory systems, to be exact. There's also, again, non-linearity of behavior. Sometimes the player just gets in the flow and is able to exploit some, crease in the defense and have an explosive moment or an explosive play. And also, all of these subsystems can affect one another. Fatigue, pressure, all of these different types of things that we experience are really all of our subsystems impacting one another. So when I began to ask myself what I was doing as an evaluator, I started to realize I was so focused on the performance, the what that was happening. And maybe the answer would lie more into the why and the how. If these are truly complex systems, how they integrate, how they interact with one another needed more attention. And I realized myself that's something I've got to focus more on. But still, how do I understand? How do we begin to understand the dynamics of these interrelationships that exist between the player and the game so we can better understand performance? How do we begin to understand this? So this is where I began to really consult with many of the members in the movement community, and there seemed to be answers, and people were pointing me in the direction of framing the player in the game and the performance relationship in terms of ecological dynamics. So ecological dynamics, what is ecological dynamics? Well, to better understand ecological dynamics, we have to understand first there's this basic understanding of degeneracy as a basic fundamental evaluative principle. And by degeneracy, what we're talking about is essentially that a player or a person can solve many different problems, or solve a singular problem rather, in many different ways. They can solve it through movement in many, many different ways. Degeneracy signifies how an individual can vary movement behavior without compromising function, and it is an important aspect of skilled performance. So there's many problems on the field, many situations that a player can solve in a multitude of ways, and they're always solving them in a multitude of ways. And the idea is this type of degeneracy gives players on the field almost limitless amounts of ways to solve a problem. So if we begin to at least accept this as a basic principle of all players on the field, how do we begin to understand what shapes the movement that we see on the field? So consider for a moment the spectacular catch in the Super Bowl by David Tyree. It's certainly something that he actually, coordinated his body to do, but it's certainly not something he practiced. How does he do that in a game? How is it that this type of movement or this type of coordinative pattern emerges? And according to Carl Newell in 1986, there's this idea of a constraints-led triangle. And this constraints triangle basically says that the entirety of the human movement system, when approaching a goal-directed behavior, is constrained. In other words, when we have an action, a goal-directed action, our movement is being constrained in potentially three initial ways. Organismic constraints like height, weight, pressure, all of those are organismic constraints. Environmental constraints such as ambient light, the way light is structured in the environment, the playing surface, the temperature, the actual weather, all of these things matter when it comes to constraining the opportunities for action on the field. Task constraints are like the boundary marking, the rules of the game, where we're positioned on the field. Even the play call might exist within that realm of task constraints. The idea is that all of these different dimensions represent the types of constraints that begin to shape the actual movements that we might have during goal-directed behavior. That these constraints are how we begin to address the degrees of freedom that exist within the human movement system and begin to channel our ability towards actually producing a functional coordinative pattern of movement. These constraints are shaping those outcomes. But there's still a piece of this that's missing. If all of these constraints are shaping our potential coordinative movement patterns, then how do we know when to perform them? And how do we know where to perform them? And that's where perception comes in. Our sensory systems, our visual systems, our sense of touch, our proprioceptive awareness, all of our abilities to understand ourselves in space, to take in information, all of the information that we're taking in is there in the environment. And this is a very big key part of ecological dynamics, which is this idea of direct perception, that there are certain things about the environment, there's information in the environment that does not require any type of processing. There is direct, rich information in the environment about space and time that allow us to channel the right movement solution in the right moment. It allows us to find that functional coordinative pattern selected under the various constraints that we are experiencing. This perception and action coupling is really rooted in the theory of James J. Gibson. And he said the continuous regulation of human behavior is predicated on the role of information, the optical, proprioceptive, and haptic information that emerge from the actual interaction between the individual and the environment are consistently guiding our activities. This idea that there's information that because of our sensory systems, we're connecting to moment after moment as the play unfolds. And we can capture this type of reciprocity, this constant exchange, in what he called affordances, which are opportunities for action. And in describing the environment in terms of affordances, we are actually given the opportunity to better understand the behaviors on the field. It's important to remember that perception and action are perpetually feeding one another. We move to perceive and we perceive to move. So what we're developing here, or what we're seeing, is maybe a framework that can understand the chaos, the messy nature of football on the field, so we can better understand how players are behaving. If perception and action are always coupled, well, then the only way we can understand how skillful a player might be in terms of understanding their movement on the field. That's how we're maybe going to get at skill. And more importantly, if we couch perception in the language of action, we have the opportunity to capture through the understanding of affordances and what they might be connecting to by the way in which they move. And it's important to understand that there are affordances that are also shared within team sports. There's affordances for action. For example, if you're a quarterback and you have a wide receiver and you know that that wide receiver has an incredible catch radius, then you might perceive the affordances for throwing the football to that wide receiver to be different than if you were throwing the football to another receiver whose catch radius is maybe a little bit more restricted. In addition, there's also this idea of affordances of. Players on the football field afford one another opportunities for action. So for example, if I'm a running back and I know that I can read the body language of my offensive guard when I'm running to a play, then it gives me the opportunity to read their body behavior and see what opportunities for action there might be based on their kinematics, based on the way in which they're moving. Very similar to this is the idea of joint affordances. The question is, how do we begin to connect to this information? And that's captured in this idea of attunement and calibration. To become attuned is to become aware of a wider range of spatial and temporal perceptual variables. It gives us a greater sensitivity to different contextual consequences of a player's action. Calibration, on the other hand, is the idea of scaling your action capabilities to that moment relative to your own physical capacities. And you're constantly calibrating and recalibrating as a play unfolds. So what we begin to get is a little bit of a cyclic kind of understanding of how development might occur. As a player performs, their intention changes. They become more attuned to different variables in the environment that specify actions or affordances. And as they become aware, they calibrate their own physical capacities in order to perform at a higher level. And this cycle repeats over and over and over again. And as it does, the player becomes more sensitive, more attuned to better information that allows them to produce at a higher, more skillful level. The implications for evaluation from this paradigm have been hopefully quite evident as I've been explaining some of it. Again, I'm open to the idea that there's a lot here for me to learn and for all of us to learn. I just wanted to present hopefully some connections that might help. The first implication that comes up is that the player and the game are intertwined. The player is in a constant state of adaptation. Third, skill is not a trait. And fourth, development does have a framework. And finally, now, with all of this movement science and all of this background in hand, I'd like to present what I hope could be a way of reframing player evaluation in American football. Instead of looking at it in terms of traits, here's what I call the player problem solver evaluative paradigm, a potential new lens for player evaluation. So if you recall from my motivation for reframing, have we in fact resolved each of the following? Have we resolved each of those questions that we set out to ask? So in terms of a conclusion of uniquely traded players, Ecological Dynamics framework seems to put anthropomorphic traits, height, weight, individual straight line speed, they're putting those into organismic constraints. They help shape the solutions on the field, but they are not the entire story. In addition, we also are looking at this idea of functionality between the player and the game as providing the basis for a more comprehensive lens of skill on the field. Traits are part of but a larger whole within this analysis. Do we have a framework for incorporating how traits and context relate? Well, in ecological dynamics, we assume that the organism and the environment are sharing and exchanging information, that there's a mutual reciprocity that exists in this entire ecosystem between the player and the game. In addition, it begins to look as if we can think about sport as a problem-solving activity in which movements are the solution. And finally, a framework for performance or skill on the field. Have we achieved that goal? Well, in terms of ecological dynamics, the acquisition of expertise in specific domains or any sport is defined as a functional relationship between an individual organism and its environment, which is characterized by attunement or their sensitivity to different informational variables and their ability to calibrate their actions to perform those movements. So the player problem solver paradigm takes all of this and tries to encapsulate it in a framework. So the first thing you'll notice is the frame of the actual evaluation. If you remember previously, we were looking at traits as being the landscape of information for us to understand. Now, instead of looking at positional traits, let's look at the problems on the field that we want our receivers to solve. Let's look at the problems on the field that we need our linebackers to solve. Let's look at positions in terms of the problems that we are asking them to solve. The scale of analysis now has to be the player within the game. We have to understand now, in terms of this ecological perspective, we now have to kind of consider this idea that the game and the player are exchanging information, and the problem is always changing and emerging. The assessment is going to be on a scale of functionality within this paradigm. How functional was their solution to the problems on hand? We have to understand that there are many problems. Problems are always changing. That's why we have a dotted line there. So as we begin to assess a player, look at those problems that they solve functionally and those problems that they solve skillfully. Again, we have this mechanism for improvement, which means that we understand that solutions that were once functional can transition to skillful solutions. Also, problems that were once we were developing solutions for, we can now suddenly have functional solutions for, or even skillful solutions for. There's no kind of hierarchy with which a player can begin to develop solutions. There's no scaffolding. It's not like you have to pass through a functional stage before becoming skillful. It could be that we dramatically, as a human movement system, begin to find the skillful solution in one moment. It could happen that instantaneously. So you'll notice that there's dotted lines throughout to signify this idea that really solutions can kind of happen in a given moment and that they always can be developing. So problems on the field can be positional, they can be scheme, or even team defined. These problems are understood to have large solution manifolds, meaning there's going to be a lot of solutions. There's going to be a lot of solutions to a potential problem. And what we can do is, if we look at a particular position, like let's say the wide receiver, we could start asking ourselves, what are the positional problems of a wide receiver? Catch the ball, get open, improve field position. These are general problems that face the wide receiver. And when we get to the traits that we were once defining as traits, we see that maybe releases, vertical stem, break point, catch point, yards after catch, these could be considered kind of subphases of those problems. The scale of analysis is going to be the performer environment system. And as we've talked before, it's the best scale to understand how the various player, task, and environmental constraints interact to coordinate goal-directed action. In other words, only if we consider everything kind of being involved in the solutions that a player displays on the field are we ever going to really begin to understand whether or not their solutions were functional or not. So how are we going to begin to assess the level of functionality of movements on the field? So here I've provided a consideration for you, a scale. The scale that exists now for understanding the quality of a solution is to look at it from a terms of least functional to more skillful. Least functional being maybe they're developing in terms of their understanding of a solution to that particular problem, to being skillful. They're highly, highly skillful and versatile in solving that solution under a variety of constraints in many different types of space and time sequences. They're able to find a solution no matter what. But how do we begin to kind of qualify the different level of solutions? So this is where we go back to affordance theory. This idea that if we look at the opportunities for action, we realize that affordances do speak to the reciprocity, the actual connection between the player and the environment. What opportunities or solutions did they have in that moment? And if we look at this affordance theory framework, we realize that player skill can be captured through the quality of their movement solutions on the field during representative exposures. So if we have a representative task, let's say of a collegiate player transitioning to the NFL, if we have a representative task that exists in a collegiate environment of something that we might see at the NFL level, then how they solve that problem, what's their quality of movement in that time, might give us a better indicator of how they're going to perform at the next level. So it becomes this quality of movement solution that may inform us as to what level of dexterity they displayed. So if we go back to Nikolai Bernstein and his definition of dexterity, Bernstein believed that dexterity was the highest level of skill within our evaluative spectrum. And he believed that it was the ability to find a motor solution for any external situation, that is to adequately solve any emerging motor problem correctly, quickly, rationally, and resourcefully. In other words, a great player on the football field is going to be able to find a solution to any situation, and he's going to be able to solve it correctly, quickly, rationally, and resourcefully. That's what he's going to be able to do. So if we use that definition as a framework for qualifying a movement on the field, we kind of come into this framework. Correctly refers to adequacy and accuracy. Adequacy refers to the meeting of a performance goal. Accuracy refers to precision. The precision of a movement is precision of sensory corrections. How precise are their solutions in terms of adapting within the moment? Quickly refers to their quickness of wit, resolution, and rapidity of successive movements. Rapidity of successive movements, for example, might be best encapsulated by a linebacker who has to shed a blocker and then pursue a tailback out of the backfield and make a tackle behind the line of scrimmage. How quickly were they able to solve successive problems in a row to achieve their goal? Rationality refers to the expediency and economy of the movement itself. By expediency, we refer to the sequencing of movements. Were they appropriate for the individual? Did they choose solutions that were appropriate for their own capabilities? Was there economy? Was there economy in terms of what they did? And by economy, we're talking about issues of calibration. Did they choose a solution that they weren't completely calibrated to? You might consider maybe a running back who seems to hesitate in the backfield far too often. Maybe they are, quote unquote, kind of pitter-pattering way too long, and as a result, they end up compromising the potential yards they could gain. That pitter-pattering might not be an economical or rational movement given that particular problem on the field. So these are ways that we can begin to distinguish between functionality of movement. And finally, resourcefulness refers to the initiative and perspective control of the movement. In some ways, anticipate what they're capable of doing next and be able to weave together the proper solution in that moment. Here's a kind of way of kind of encapsulating everything when we're looking at a player. We might want to consider the problem that we're looking at. What problem are we studying? What phase of the problem are we studying? If we're studying catching a football, are we looking at the actual catching phase? Are we looking at the separation phase within the route? Where are we looking? What is the problem that we're defining? And we should be doing this on the level of understanding the player's constraints in that moment, the environmental constraints and task constraints that exist in that moment, or any other constraints. And what we may want to do is begin to ask ourselves not whether or not they solved each phase of the problem correctly or whatever phase of study that we're looking at, but we want to make sure we start looking at the quality of movement that exists on that time frame. We want to look, was the problem solved correctly, quickly, rationally, and resourcefully? We want to try to capture whether or not these criteria were met, or to what degree these criteria were met. Again, this is not an answer. It's just a framework to maybe ask ourselves better questions, because this is where I think there's so many brilliant people in the evaluation community. The professional levels, obviously, so many brilliant people. I just wonder if sometimes we're not asking ourselves the right questions, and that might be some of the reason why we miss out on these unique players. So maybe if we follow this type of framework or adapt a version of this framework, maybe it gives us the opportunity to ask better questions about the quality of movement, which is directly connected to the skill level of the player, and that'll allow us to see how they might perform at the next level. And obviously now, last and finally, we now have a framework for improvement. By understanding how the player is moving on the field, we can better understand the types of problems that they struggle with. We can understand where they need to improve their understanding of intention, attunement, and calibration. So now when we can give a report on a player, we have the opportunity to share a depth of information that might inform players, coaches, strength and conditioning coaches at the next level. This idea of sharing information in terms of functionality of movement, in terms of the types of problems that they can solve on the field, now give us an entire array of ways to share information that will immediately be actionable up and down all levels. Here are some important considerations and principles for implementation. First, we have to always remember that there's 2 players on the field or more. There's many players on the field. And as a result, everybody gets a vote. So everybody is involved in shaping the information that's available on the field. What the player is connecting to is just as much influenced by the task, the environment, and their constraints, but also the information on the field is shaped by their opponent as well. In addition, we have to really try, and this is something that Sean Mishka, again, of Movement to Mastery, is really big on. You got to put yourself in the player's shoes. We have to start thinking about what information are they connecting to? What does their movement behavior or their solution to the problem that we've defined on the field, what does that say about their skill level? What are they actually connecting to? We also need to ask ourselves or remind ourselves that affordances, the opportunities for action, are just that. They're opportunities. And as a result, these are like invitations. They can be accepted or they can be ignored. The question is, if they're not being accepted, why? What does that say about the skill level of the player? Also, we have to really push ourselves to find representative exposures. And representative exposures are things that represent the problems on the field that they're going to see at the next level. So these are the things I had to push myself to do as I'm starting to adapt this type of paradigm. And finally, I have to push myself to understand that the law of space and time, something that I thought Fergus Connolly and Pat White did very well in their book on Game Changer, they talked about this idea that space creates time, and that dexterity, space, and time are really in many ways related to one another. The idea is that I have to remind myself that no natural phenomena can be understood carefully without carefully considering how it emerged. In other words, if I want to understand what makes a great player great on the field, the answer is hidden within their movement. So as we begin to kind of close out this discussion, it made me ask myself, so what do I have here? I have a list of traits, but where do they sit? In a player problem solver evaluation paradigm, these different traits now, some of them are going to be organismic, some of them are going to be subphases of a problem, and some of them are going to actually be encapsulated within their movement skill. So I think that this framework encapsulates all the great work of every evaluator already practicing film evaluation, but allows us to take another step in a larger direction in terms of unification, in terms of unifying all these traits under one kind of bantam, which is how do players solve problems on the field? In addition to evaluation implications, there's also some implications of this paradigm on other areas. For example, recruiting, the economy of selection. By actually looking at the problems that a player solves on the field, we can begin to at least economize the types of picks that a team might be looking for. So imagine if this were to play out on a team level, there could be an entirety of problems that you're hoping to solve on a team level. And what you can do is you can begin to economize your draft board to find players that solve those problems. Also, in terms of a coaching staff, this offers some implications in terms of how to evaluate or how to discern the effectiveness of a coaching staff as an assessment of their capacity to develop players to meet positional problems. Player development plans can be crafted as a landscape of problems to facilitate continuous growth and skill development. In addition, there might be potential implications of this paradigm on free agency. This idea that a competitive advantage can be achieved through such a paradigm as player value can be redefined in terms of their capability to address the landscape of problems inherent within a particular team. Also within game preparation and management, this paradigm could offer an economy of strategy. Implementation of this paradigm could offer insights into opponent preparation as well as the configuration of subpackages. Maybe this particular group of players understand one another and the problems that they can solve so well that they can work very skillfully together. It could also give a play caller dexterity of play calling and personnel management because they can improve subpackages that they use. In closing, I just wanted to offer these references. These are some of the references that have led me down this road and have really produced what I've shared with you today. And hopefully this video at least begins to ask different questions about the evaluation practices that we use. And hopefully I've shared with you and not bored you, but provided you with evidence that suggests that there might be a different way to frame evaluation. But I'm positive in my mind and in my heart that there's something to this understanding of looking at players in terms of not of the traits that they possess, but in terms of the problems that they can solve. And by in terms of the problems that they can solve, we can better understand their movement on the field, and we can assess the functionality to which they actually solved the problem on the field. And by doing that, we can get to their skill level. And if we can understand their skill level, their ability to adapt at the next level, then I think we're going to be in a situation where we're going to have continued and increased success in player evaluation. Thank you so much for your time and patience, and I truly appreciate you investing your time and energy into this presentation.